What if Hollywood's biggest legends were not just performing, but quietly struggling to hold it all together? Behind those perfect smiles were sleepless nights, years of heavy drinking, and choices that would shock audiences today. They had fame, money, and everything the world envies, yet still unraveled in ways no one saw coming. And the worst parts never made it on screen. So how much can a person really consume before the habit starts consuming them? 1. When you hear the name Frank Sinatra, you probably think of smooth vocals, sharp suits, and a glass, always within reach. And you would not be wrong. Sinatra did not just enjoy a drink, he made it part of his rhythm, like a song he never quite stopped playing. His preferred method was precise: 4 ice cubes, 2 fingers of Jack Daniel's whiskey, topped with a splash of still water. 1 bottle per day was not a rumor, it was routine. On a good night, he was charming, magnetic, the kind of man who could light up a room without even trying. But that same habit could make him sharp and quick-tempered, someone who did not mind picking a fight even with friends. He ran with a crowd they jokingly referred to as the American Olympic drinking team, and that was not far from the truth. He kept going right into his later years, never quite letting go. And in a way that feels almost poetic, when Sinatra passed away on May 14, 1998, his daughter Nancy, insured a bottle of Jack Daniel's, was placed beside him in the coffin like an old companion he simply could not leave behind. 2. Michael Landon was the kind of man television made you trust. Calm voice, warm smile, the picture-perfect family figure. But behind that image, he was carrying something far heavier. While he played the devoted father on screen, he was drinking heavily and had developed a pattern of alcohol dependence that worsened significantly through the 1970s. His co-stars had their suspicions, but even they did not fully grasp how deep it went. Melissa Gilbert, who worked alongside him as a child on Little House on the Prairie, later recalled noticing the smell, something she admitted in her own words, stayed with her long into adulthood. Landon was also a heavy smoker for many years, though he eventually quit in the early 1980s. Despite his public image of strength and control, the toll was real. In April of 1991, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Just 12 weeks later, on July 1st, 1991, he passed away at the age of 54, a man who looked like he had everything together, while quietly losing the battle all along. 3. Ava Gardner was not just beautiful. She was the kind of woman who walked into a room and made the whole place feel louder. Sharp tongue, quick wit, and a personality that did not ask for permission. In the 1950s and 60s, she was not just a star, she was the party. She ran with extraordinary names: Frank Sinatra, Salvador Dali, Tennessee Williams, and wherever that crowd gathered, things rarely stayed quiet. Alcohol was always close by, not as a problem at first, more like a companion that fueled the laughter and kept the night going longer than it should. There is a well-documented story from the set of The Night of the Iguana, in which director John Huston famously matched her drink for drink during a tense moment in production, the kind of on-set dynamic that speaks to the atmosphere she often created. For all the drinking, however, it was ultimately the cigarettes that caught up with her. Years of heavy smoking led to emphysema, 2 strokes at the age of 64 that left her partially bedridden, and eventually pneumonia, which caused her passing on January 25, 1990, at the age of 67. 4. Broderick Crawford was best known as the tough, no-nonsense lawman on Highway Patrol, which aired in syndication from 1955 to 1959. On screen, he looked like authority itself. Off-screen, things were considerably messier. He was dealing with 2 pressures at once: the grind of a demanding weekly television schedule and a drinking habit that kept getting worse. Over time, that habit did not stay hidden. It spilled out into real life: multiple stops and arrests for driving under the influence, one after another. There were moments on set where his condition made it difficult to function properly, and production had to accommodate the situation, including scenes involving driving, which eventually had to be filmed on restricted roads after his license was suspended. People in the industry gave him a nickname, Old 502, a reference to the police code for impaired driving. Not exactly the kind of title you want when you are the face of a law enforcement series. The California Highway Patrol, whose image was tied to the show, grew increasingly uncomfortable with the association. In the end, the show was canceled, with the department's withdrawal of support cited as a contributing factor. 5. Robin Williams was a comedic genius, the kind of performer who could make a room laugh in seconds. But early in his career, he wrestled with cocaine and alcohol, a combination that was already taking a serious toll. The turning point came in 1982, after the passing of his close friend John Belushi. That moment prompted Williams to step back from cocaine, and he remained sober for nearly 2 decades. Alcohol, however, remained a presence in his life at different points, and he spoke about it openly in later years, including in a 2006 interview with Diane Sawyer, where he explained that the pull of drinking does not always come from a clear reason. Sometimes, he said, it simply waits until the moment you believe you are fine, and then suddenly you are not. He described it as something that creeps up without warning, one moment feeling in control, the next completely adrift, unsure how you even got there. Despite efforts to manage it throughout his life, the struggle never fully disappeared. The world lost one of its most extraordinary talents on August 11, 2014. His story is a reminder that no level of success, talent, or self-awareness makes anyone immune. 6. Clara Bow was the iconic it girl of the silent film era, the kind of star who did not just follow the spotlight but pulled it along with her. As the face of the flapper generation, she lived exactly the way people imagined: fast, loud, and without much restraint. Parties were constant, alcohol was always close, and her relationships were just as unpredictable. She was frequently the most electric and most disruptive presence in any room. One story that circulates from that era describes an incident at a Hollywood gathering hosted by Paramount's BP. Schulberg, where Bow reportedly arrived in an already altered state, made a bold and very public display of attention toward a man in front of others present, and was ultimately escorted from the event by studio staff. Whether every detail of that account is precisely accurate, it reflects the kind of behavior that became her reputation during those years: unfiltered, unpredictable, and impossible to contain. In those days, Hollywood could build a star overnight. Controlling one like her was another matter entirely. 7. Robert Shaw was the man who brought Quint to life in Jaws: tough, weathered, the kind of character who looked like he had seen everything. On screen, he delivered exactly that. But behind the scenes, the real tension was not in the water. During filming, Shaw leaned heavily on scotch to get through the long and demanding days. His drinking began to affect the atmosphere on set, particularly with his co-star Richard Dreyfuss. Dreyfuss later acknowledged that he much preferred working with Shaw when he was sober, when he was not. His mood shifted, he became harder to work with, and increasingly unpredictable. There is a moment that people who worked on that production still reference. One night, after a long day of filming, Shaw provoked Dreyfuss during a drinking session, and the tension between the two escalated beyond what the cameras ever captured. On screen, Shaw played a man chasing something dangerous. Off-screen, he was dealing with something just as relentless. And as the filming continued, the line between control and chaos kept slipping. 8. Drew Barrymore grew up in the spotlight long before she ever had a chance to fully understand it. As a young girl, she was surrounded by Hollywood's glamour, bright lights, and a lifestyle that moved far too fast for someone her age. According to her own autobiography, Little Girl Lost, she began consuming alcohol at the age of 9, was regularly using marijuana by 10, and had developed a reliance on cocaine by 12. She entered a rehabilitation center at 13. Most young people that age are still trying to figure out who they are, while she was trying to fight something far heavier. Even after stepping back from substances in her teens, alcohol remained a recurring presence in her life, persistent and hard to fully shake. She spoke about it openly in later years, describing it not as something tied to celebration or escape, but as a cycle that did not need a reason. One that made you believe you were in control right up until the moment it became clear you were not. Drew Barrymore did not just grow up in Hollywood. She had to find a way to survive it. 9. Orson Welles was a legend in cinema and theater, brilliant, creative, larger than life in every sense. But alongside that extraordinary talent was a complicated relationship with alcohol that followed him for decades. Part of it traced back to his upbringing. His father Richard was himself an alcoholic, largely absent and incapacitated in his final years, and Welles essentially became the adult figure in that relationship while still a young man. The very pattern he witnessed growing up became something he could not fully avoid himself. While working in Europe, Welles famously promoted the Negroni cocktail with great enthusiasm, speaking about it in terms that sounded almost like a philosophy. His habits grew heavier over time. The physical toll of years of excess was plainly visible, as his weight climbed well past 300 pounds. He passed away in October of 1985 at the age of 70. Orson Welles was undeniably a giant in his field, but sometimes the things we inherit or choose to explain away end up shaping us more than we ever expect. 10. Gail Russell was one of those faces Hollywood believed in early. As a teenager, she had natural beauty and a quiet, reserved quality that Paramount Pictures saw enormous potential in, even without any formal acting training. But behind that soft image, pressure was already building. Fame arrived fast, and with it came expectations she was simply not prepared for. Somewhere along the way, alcohol became her method of coping. What started quietly did not stay that way for long. By the early 1950s, the roles had slowed down, and her drinking had become something no one could ignore. There were arrests for impaired driving, public incidents, and eventually a period in a treatment facility in Seattle in an attempt to get things under control. She returned to acting for a time, but the underlying struggle never truly left her. Her story came to an end on August 26, 1961. She was 36 years old. Her cause of passing was listed officially as acute and chronic alcoholism. Some stories do not fall apart all at once. They wear down slowly, piece by piece, until there is nothing left to hold together. 11. Anthony Hopkins has always carried himself with a quiet, unshakable intensity, the kind of presence that feels deliberate and precise, both on screen and off. But before the legendary roles and the awards, there was a real and serious battle. Alcohol had taken a firm hold, not casually, but in the way that builds day by day until it becomes part of how you function. Hopkins has spoken about it openly in later years, describing it plainly as a mental and physical condition, no excuses, no attempts to dress it up. There were moments, he admitted, when he genuinely was not sure he was going to make it through. But here is what sets his story apart from so many others. He stopped and stayed stopped. Not for a short stretch, but for 47 consecutive years. That is not luck. That is a decision made again and again, every single day. In a message he shared publicly while marking that milestone, he spoke directly to people going through the same struggle. No grand speeches, just a quiet, sincere reminder. Be kind to yourself, and do not give up. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is stop before it is too late. 12. Dean Martin was known as the King of Cool, a man who made everything look effortless, especially holding a drink. On stage, he built an entire persona around it. The charming, slightly unsteady entertainer who always had a glass in hand and a well-timed line ready. But behind that image, the truth was rather different. Those closest to him, including his daughter Deanna, later revealed that much of it was a carefully crafted performance. That glass he carried so casually on stage, more often than not, it was apple juice. He understood his audience perfectly and gave them exactly what they expected night after night without ever letting it take genuine control of his life. Off stage, Martin was far more grounded, a dedicated family man who kept his private life stable. He enjoyed a single cocktail in the evening, nothing excessive, and nothing out of hand. While others around him in that world were losing themselves in the lifestyle, Martin maintained a firm grip on where the performance ended and real life began. He passed away in 1995 at the age of 78, a man who played the role of a drinker better than almost anyone, without ever letting it play him. 13. Paul Lynde was the kind of personality you simply could not miss. Quick wit, sharp tongue, always ready with a line that landed exactly right. On shows like Bewitched and Hollywood Squares, he brought humor that felt completely effortless. But off camera, things did not run nearly as smoothly. Behind that lively image was a man dealing with pressure on more than one front, navigating his identity as a gay man during a period that was far from accepting and coping with that weight through alcohol. His drinking was not occasional, it was constant, and it led him into situations that became increasingly difficult to ignore. He became a regular at establishments far from the public eye, frequently consuming past the point of control. There were incidents, confrontations, and repeated encounters with the authorities. One night, things escalated far enough to involve a police pursuit. And in a moment that sounds almost unreal, Lynde reportedly leaned out of the window and addressed an officer in his signature theatrical voice, as though ordering from a menu. It might sound amusing on the surface, but it was not a joke anymore. The pattern kept repeating and the toll kept building. Over time, his health began to decline, worn down by years of heavy consumption. Paul Lynde passed away on January 10, 1982, at the age of 55, from a massive heart attack brought on by years of substance abuse. A man who made millions of people laugh quietly, losing control every time the cameras were off. 14. Glenn Ford had the kind of charm that did not fade easily, the classic leading man with a steady voice and a confident presence. His personal life, however, was anything but settled. His relationships over the decades included a 16-year marriage to dancer Eleanor Powell, as well as a long and intermittent connection with Rita Hayworth that lasted the better part of 4 decades, one that ended with Ford serving as a pallbearer at her funeral. There were others along the way, and those relationships rarely ended cleanly. That kind of life carries its costs. The marriages did not last, and more than once he came away with less than he started, both financially and emotionally. Somewhere in the middle of all that, alcohol stepped in and took a stronger hold, growing from a habit into a problem that began to affect not just his career but his physical health over time. Still, through everything, Ford never quite lost that natural ease. Even as things shifted around him, he kept moving forward. He passed away on August 30th, 2006, at the age of 90, a long life, without question, but one that illustrates clearly how success, complicated relationships, and personal struggles can collide in ways nobody truly sees coming. 15. W.C. Fields was one of the most recognizable faces in early Hollywood, a man who built an entire career on the image of a grumbling, glass-in-hand cynic who trusted nobody and questioned everything. The persona was funny because it felt real, and in many ways, it was. Fields consumed alcohol in extraordinary quantities throughout his adult life, reportedly drinking as much as 2 quarts of gin per day at his peak. He kept bottles hidden across his property in plant pots, behind books, inside prop cases, anywhere he believed no one would look. Not because he was ashamed, but because he simply did not want anyone standing between him and his next drink. He once remarked that he kept a supply on hand in case of snakebite, and when pressed about the snake, replied that he also kept one of those nearby. The humor masked a reality that was far less amusing. His health deteriorated steadily through the 1930s and 40s. His nose, famously bulbous and red, became a physical marker of decades of heavy consumption. He was hospitalized multiple times and warned repeatedly by doctors that continuing would cost him his life. He continued anyway. W.C. Fields passed away on December 25, 1946, Christmas Day, at the age of 66. A man who made the world laugh at a habit that was quietly consuming him from the inside. 16. Veronica Lake was one of the defining images of 1940s Hollywood, the peekaboo blonde, the cool gaze, the effortless screen presence that made audiences stop and stare. At her peak, she was one of the most photographed women in America. But that peak did not last long, and the descent was far less glamorous than the rise. By her late 20s, the major roles had already begun to dry up. The studio system that had built her up moved on, and Lake found herself without the structure or support she had depended on. Alcohol became a constant presence, not as a social habit, but as a daily reliance that grew heavier with each passing year. There were public incidents, erratic behavior, and a reputation that made producers hesitant to hire her even for smaller parts. She spent stretches of the 1950s and 60s largely out of the public eye, working as a waitress in New York, at one point a fact that became a tabloid story in itself. She made occasional attempts at a comeback and spoke honestly in later interviews about the years she had lost. Veronica Lake passed away on July 7, 1973, at the age of 50, from hepatitis linked to years of heavy alcohol consumption. One of Hollywood's most striking faces, quietly worn away by a struggle most of the world never saw coming. 17. John Barrymore was considered by many to be the finest stage and screen actor of his generation, a man of extraordinary talent, devastating good looks, and a presence that simply could not be manufactured. He was called the Great Profile. He could have had everything. In many ways, he did. And then he spent decades systematically dismantling it. His relationship with alcohol began early and never truly paused. By the time he reached middle age, the drinking had become so severe that he could no longer reliably memorize his lines. Directors began arranging for cue cards to be placed around sets hidden in props, taped to furniture, held just out of frame simply to get through a day of filming. His co-stars often had to adjust their own performances to accommodate his lapses. The physical decline was visible and rapid. The man who had once commanded the stage at Shakespeare could now barely hold a conversation without losing his thread. Friends and family watched helplessly as one of the most gifted performers of the 20th century gradually became unrecognizable. John Barrymore passed away on May 29, 1942, at the age of 60. His final years were marked more by chaos than by craft, a reminder that talent, no matter how extraordinary, cannot outlast a habit that is never addressed. 18. Diana Barrymore inherited her father, John's name, his looks, and tragically his relationship with alcohol. She arrived in Hollywood in the early 1940s with considerable attention and genuine potential. The Barrymore name alone guaranteed interest. But the pressure of living inside that legacy proved far heavier than the opportunities it opened. She struggled with alcohol from her early 20s onward, and her behavior on and off set became increasingly unpredictable. Roles became harder to secure. Relationships collapsed. There were arrests, public scenes, and periods of treatment that brought temporary stability before things unraveled again. She wrote about much of it herself in her 1952 memoir, Too Much, Too Soon, a title that captured her story with painful accuracy. The book was adapted into a film just a few years later, turning her private unraveling into public entertainment. Diana Barrymore passed away on January 25, 1960, at the age of 38. The cause was an accidental overdose of alcohol combined with sedatives. She had spoken openly about wanting to turn things around, and there were people around her who believed she might. Sometimes the desire to change and the ability to sustain that change are two very different things, and the distance between them is where so many stories end. So, there you have it. Hollywood's most brilliant names and the habits they carried long after the cameras stopped rolling. Fame gave them everything, but it could not save all of them. Behind every legend is a human being, and sometimes the most important story is the one that never made it on screen. Thank you for watching. Stay safe and take care of yourselves.